Awesome. So be very much welcome to this webinar from HowGood on mastering carbon footprint automation at the enterprise level. I'm beyond excited because today you have both Brian Ash, a very good friend and VP of Corporate Sustainability at Ingredion, speaking about his experience implementing GHG accounting at one of the world's largest ingredient suppliers. And I'll be trying to catch up with Brian and share a little bit of the HowGood experience in the GHG accounting space. So good to have you, Brian. Thank you for joining. And you're going to be, yeah. And as we move forward, feel free to introduce yourself and post your thoughts and questions throughout the webinar in the Zoom chat. We're going to have a dedicated session to go through those questions and make sure that none of those questions are left unanswered. So with that said, we have a pretty ambitious agenda for today. The agenda today, we're going to start with an introduction to carbon footprint automation. So specifically talking about what is carbon footprinting, why it's needed, what approaches exist out there, and what is the promise of automation in this space. Then Brian is going to be talking specifically about a case study at Ingredion and how Ingredion and HowGood have partnered on GHG accounting. And I think Brian really brings the real world corporate experience of grounding this strategy and the automation into real practice. And then part number 3, we're going to be looking at conclusions and discussion. We're going to be addressing your questions and sharing some next steps. So with that said, we're going to start with the first part, with introduction to carbon footprint automation. And so we're going to be doing a quick review of the carbon accounting landscape. And so, if we're doing a GHG accounting or carbon footprinting webinar, let's maybe start with the basics. So carbon footprinting, or maybe better said, as we preferred here at HowGood, greenhouse gas accounting, is how we estimate and measure the physical quantities of greenhouse gas emissions and removals assigned to different subjects over time. And this piece of over time is really important because it's what kind of makes accounting, right? You want to measure emissions in a way that is consistent over time so you can make comparisons. And there are kind of 2 branches of GHG accounting that are really important. The first one is attributional accounting, where we're looking at creating inventories of emissions across a time period. And then there is consequential accounting methods, where we're trying to quantify how much a mitigation action reduces emissions. And this distinction is really, really important, right? Because if you are trying to understand the impact of an action on reducing emissions, you should make sure that you're using a consequential method, because sometimes if you're measuring the impact of an initiative that is outside of the system boundaries that are using, then you can basically end up not seeing the unintended effects that your initiative has outside of your system boundaries. So talking about system boundaries, we can talk about national inventories, kind of the country, the emissions of a country, the emissions of a city, the emissions of ourselves as individuals, or actually corporate emissions like Ingredions, the emissions of facilities or the emissions of products. Now, why are we bothering even about greenhouse gas emissions accounting, right? So what we know is that climate stability is key to sustain life on Earth as we know it. And quite a few years ago in the Paris Agreement, 196 countries committed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And there is this tool called the Climate Action Tracker, where you can see where the current commitments will take us in terms of global warming potential. And if we don't do anything else, the world will warm up 2.7 degrees by 2100. And so we're definitely off track on our work to reduce global warming. And we also know that the food system is a key driver of these emissions. At least 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. And so if we are to solve this and mitigate global warming for real, then we as food designers and innovators are definitely part of the problem and also part of the solution. Now, what is the business case, right? There is a planetary case. There is a planetary survival case, if you will it. Now, there is also an actual business case for greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So the first one is enhanced sales growth. Here at HowGood, we're seeing that products that are climate friendly and that communicate their climate friendly claims to shoppers are growing 23% times faster. We're also seeing regulatory compliance, more and more regulations like European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive are mandating greenhouse gas emissions accounting for corporates. And so this is becoming table stakes. And the third one is reduced legal risk. There's been a 300% growth in climate change litigation in the last 20 years. And so if you want to mitigate that risk for your company, then you need to have GHG accounting systems in place. And so, but then if this is important for a planetary perspective, if there is a business case for GHG accounting, why is it that it is so difficult? And there are three things that we often hear from our partners. The first one is accounting complexity. We're going to be looking at the accounting standards in just a minute, but the standards and regulations around GHG accounting are constantly evolving, and staying up to date is really tough. You probably know some of these acronyms: the GHG protocol, SBTI, ISO, TCFD, IPCC, and it is tough to be up to date with all that is happening and all the new research accounting evolutions over time. The second one is data shortage. So even if the accounting standards were simple and clear and unified, it is really hard to get good quality GHG data. And so what this means is that many companies end up using spend-based methods or global averages, which can be often highly inaccurate or misleading. And the third big challenge is resource intensity. And they kind of are related to the previous two challenges, because if the accounting standards are complex, if there isn't data out there, then it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources to do those assessments. And so what we're seeing is, even with access to data, a traditional life cycle assessment can cost over $100,000 and take 1 year to complete, which makes it difficult to implement at scale for large companies, but also makes it very difficult for small and growing brands who are trying to change the food system and make a sustainability claim to get the data they need to make that claim and reap the market rewards they deserve. So then the question is, okay, how are companies approaching GHG accounting? And what we've seen is the traditional approaches to GHG accounting have historically included a mix of methods. And in these metrics, you see we're analyzing methods based on granularity, whether there is low granularity in the emissions accounting or high granularity, and the speed of the assessment, how quick it takes for you to get a result. And data granularity is really important in GHG accounting, because for the same product, take it for example for corn or for beef, emissions factors can vary 50-fold depending on the origin, the certification, the practice, the manufacturing process. And so data granularity is really important, because it's what it allows you to use an emissions factor that is reflective of your real supply system and not of something else. And so the method that is very quick, but doesn't have granularity at all, is the spend-based method, where you're basically just taking how much you spend on food or agricultural raw materials and you multiply that by an emissions factor. That's really quick, but it's very rough and often highly misleading. One that is much more granular and equally and usually relatively fast is the lifecycle inventory databases. So you would go to a lifecycle inventory database and you would search for an emissions factor there. Now, often those are kind of secondary emission factors. And then the other option is do a study that is highly granular, but that is relatively slow to complete. And that's kind of where most of traditional life cycle assessments usually fall. They're very detailed, very precise, but they take months or even years to finalize. And so what we've been doing here at HowGood has been how kind of asking ourselves the question of how can we apply automation technologies to hopefully bring traditional life cycle assessments into assessments that can be highly granular, but that can be delivered at the speed of a life cycle inventory database. And so there are three things that we've learned throughout this journey that are kind of, three, if you call it, imperatives for automation success, based on the 17 years that HowGood has spent trying to crack this nut, if you will. The first one is aligning to accounting standards. The second one is managing for data quality. And the third one is defining the right strategic requirements for the solution you're trying to build. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into each one of these. So imperative number one, regarding accounting standards, one of the things that we think is really important to understand is just like the diversity of the GHG accounting landscape that exists out there. So on one hand, we have the international frameworks, which define the big why. So we're trying to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees versus pre-industrial levels. On the other hand, we have the market regulations. And so these are the pieces of legislation in the markets where we operate that define the types of sustainability disclosures we have to make. And then we have the accounting and disclosure standards. Here you have a list of the different accounting and disclosure standards that we're tracking here at HowGood. But you also see here on the right-hand side some of the ones that are most common for the food and beverage sector. And so in our case here at HowGood, we follow very closely the GHG protocol. We follow very closely the ISO standards and also the Science-Based Targets Initiative standards and guidance for forestry, land, and agriculture. Now, imperative number two is to really make sure that you manage for data quality. And the way we think about data quality here at HowGood is by looking at how granular the data is. And so here you can see on the left-hand side how we evaluate data granularity. And so at the most basic level, we're going to be searching for basic information. The UPC, the name of the product, the category, the ingredient list, something you can find on, on the pack of an ingredient label. The other level of data granularity is what we call kind of additional data that's, usually you don't find in a back of pack label, but that you will find usually with the manufacturer of that product. That will include the bill of materials, the percentage inclusion of each ingredient, information like the processing yields. Then we're going to be looking at country of origin and certifications. What are the source origins of the raw materials? What types of certifications were used? We then look at agricultural and production practices. And there is a big difference between, for example, an intensive coffee monoculture or a coffee grown in an agroforestry system. And we also look at production practices. And then we start gathering detailed geographic and primary data. So we're going to be looking at geospatial coordinates, maybe farm-specific input data, the energy mix at the facilities where those products were manufactured. And the last level of detail is where you actually have the full life cycle assessment inventory with the full metrics and model available. And one of the things that we usually work with our partners and tell them is, you don't have to wait until you have perfect data, until you have 100% primary data to do all of the accounting that you need to do. You can start with the data you have and gradually increase data granularity over time. And this is important as long as you follow the GHG accounting principles that are here on the right, especially the one around conservativeness, right? So if you're not able yet to ingest primary data and you're using mostly basic information, that's okay. You can still do GHG accounting, but make sure that you're conservative so that you're not sub-estimating emissions. The worst case scenario, you're overestimating them. Now, one of the other things is when you're looking at where to gather data, one of the concepts in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change methodology, is understanding key categories. Key categories are the ones that drive the most emissions, and it's the ones where you have to have the best accounting methods and the most data granularity. And here you can see some of the carbon footprints of some of the common food commodities out there. And one of the big conclusions when you look at this graph, can you see how big is the black bar, the gray bar, and the purple bar? That accounts for land use, feed, and farm level emissions. All of that together usually drives 80% of the footprint of most food products. So if there is a place where you want to have data granularity, where you want to have good GHG accounting methodologies that are really refined, is looking at farm level and land use emissions, because those are going to be driving the bulk of your impact. And last but not least, we then have the defining strategic requirements of what you're trying to build. So if you're trying to automate GHG accounting, there are probably a couple of things that you should be looking at. And this is applicable whether you're looking for a third-party provider or whether you're trying to build your own solution. But here are some of the things that we recommend from the team here at HowGood. The first one is you want to have capability for full life cycle product GHG accounting, right? You want to make sure that you can evaluate the impact of a product from end to end. Two, you also want to do this for the corporate emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And so what we often see is sometimes companies have different methods to estimate corporate emissions versus product emissions. And HowGood built a system that allows you to actually do both and ensure that they're based on the same data. Three, you want to make sure that you have the capacity to ingest and evaluate quality of supplier primary data at scale. And in the case of HowGood, we have a material directory that we use for this, but this is really important because this is what will allow you to gain granularity and precision over time. Four, you want to have good data integration capabilities. So look for an API that can make, hopefully as smooth as it can be, the integration between your ERP and the system you're trying to build. Five, search for databases that are specific for the food system, because the food system is highly complex. And so you want to make sure that you are using emission factors that reflect the nature of the raw materials you're using. Six, look for transparency into data sources. Seven, look for compliance with the GHG accounting standards that we just covered. Eight, look for compliance with information security standards, right? If you're looking at do the GHG accounting of a formula that is innovative, you want to make sure that your trade secrets are as much protected as they possibly can be. Two, as much as you're focusing on carbon, don't lose sight of other metrics. And so prioritize platforms that can also give you access to other metrics. And 10, look for platforms that can enable you to dashboard and do different types of simulation and scenario planning, so you have what it takes to reach your GHG accounting goals. So when you do this right, what we've seen from our experience at HowGood is that we can cut by 90% the time required to evaluate the product. We can cut by 97% the investment it takes to evaluate the impact of a product. We can drive up to 23% higher sales for products that emit low carbon attributes. And we can do this while achieving 25 times more granularity by having better access to emissions factors for each food raw material. So now I'm going to take you through a quick demo of our platform, just so you can see how these things actually work in practice. And looking at actually, a live demo of the platform itself. So I'm going to share screen, and in 3, 2, 1, we're ready. So here you can see the typical retail environment. So usually the way this works is a retailer or a food supplier or a food service company would send a data extract from their ERP into HowGood. We would ingest it, and then we would do a bulk uploading to the system. So you can see on the left-hand side some of the common product categories of retailers, from baking category, beverages category, bread and bakery. Now, if we look at breakfast and cereal, you can see the list of products included, the ingredients, the annual sales volume. And I want to show you how good does the automation at the product level, so you can see kind of the work that we do automatically at an ingredient level for every given product. So once I click here in the Food Co protein bar, the vanilla flavor, there's a couple of things you can see. You can see immediately the carbon footprint of the product. So in this case, 7.27 cradle to manufacturing date. You can see whether the product meets a certain climate-friendly attribute or a low carbon threshold. And then you can break down emissions based on life cycle stages. How much is agriculture, over 50%, and how much, for example, is packaging. But then the really powerful thing is that you can edit this, and this is where automation comes in. For example, I can look at the different ingredients that make this product, from the chocolate to the whey protein concentrate, the sorbitol, the vitamin B3, and see the emissions associated with it. I can also look at the impact by kilogram. And so in this case, this will tell me impact per kilogram of product and not just the contribution to the overall product. Now you can see, if we look at the impact by contribution, that the two biggest ingredients that drive most of the emissions is the chocolate and the whey protein concentrate for these snack bar. Now in the HowGood system, if you click on any given data point, you can see how you can improve the impact as a product developer. You can see where the product falls in terms of the emissions spectrum within the food system. You can see which origins are highest emissions versus lowest emissions. And you can also see the link to specific data sources. So for example, if I copy paste the link here, it will take me to the LCA study that HowGood used to model the emissions factor for whey protein concentrate. And so this transparency into the actual data sources is really important because it's what drives assurance readiness. Now, Ingredion is a plant-based ingredient company. And so let's suppose that instead of the whey protein concentrate, what happens if we replace it by a pea protein concentrate? So in the HowGood system, you can make these changes. In this case, I'm replacing it by a standard ingredient. And as we've discussed before, depending on the origin, impacts can be very different. So the emissions factors, for example, for pea protein concentrate can vary from 0.2 for Belgium all the way to, for example, 0.42 to Guatemala. So let's suppose we go with Guatemala. You can see that there was an improvement on the greenhouse gas emissions of the product. But again, sometimes you don't just want to use an industry average. Sometimes you want to use a supplier-specific emissions factor. And so what happens if we actually go here and we actually use an emissions factor specific for an ingredient, like an Ingredion's VitaEssence product? So you can see in this case that the HowGood system ingests the primary data from the supplier. It tags it as a vendor verified material. And this means that this emissions factor is supplier specific and is not just a country average. And as you make this change, you can see that the carbon footprint cradle to farm gate reduced from 6.60 to 4.55. And all of these changes that you've just saw that we can make for carbon emissions and for the different ingredients, the HowGood system allows you to track other metrics beyond carbon. It allows you to track impacts across packaging, the sales and distribution, transportation legs. And then once you're done with the updates, you can create a product carbon footprint report. And once you export this report, you can open it up. And once the report is ready, you can see how, in this case, we've done a GAG full life cycle study for a specific product with the results of the carbon footprint, the life cycle stages, the assumptions, the description of system boundaries, and all the description of the actual data sources in just a couple of minutes. So this is an example of an automation technology at work in just 5 minutes. And now I actually wanted to invite my dear friend Brian to talk a little bit more about kind of how they've been approaching this at Ingredion and how it has been the experience and the results so far.
Perfect.
You go, Brian.
Thank you, Joao. And I should put you on our marketing team. Thanks for dropping in our ingredient. We didn't go through that ahead of time, so I didn't know he was going to do that, but I much appreciated. So just a little background on Ingredion, I guess, so you guys can understand perspective of what I'm going to talk about. We're a global ingredient solution provider. We've got about 12,000 people. We operate worldwide. Many customers in the food and beverage space. That's the majority of our customers, and I've seen a lot of them on the call today. And then we've got our commitments like everybody else, right? We want to have 100% of our tier 1 priority crops sustainably sourced. We've got SBTI validated carbon reduction targets. So kind of the standard things I think that you would expect. Our 2030 strategy is called our All Life Plan. We have 3 pillars, as you can see. We've got everyday life, planet life, and connected life. And I'll say this, even though planet life has our carbon reduction targets in it, those kind of spider web out to all aspects of this. So for example, in everyday life, we have targets around innovation, and they very much have a role to play in reducing the carbon footprint, particularly for scope 3, but also some of our scope 1. And then in connected life, we're looking at sustainable and regenerative agriculture. So again, they're looking at how do we source different crops, source from different areas, implement regenerative or sustainable practices, and how is that driving, again, some scope 3 emission reduction. There we go. It's just a little bit of a delay, sorry. So on our customer engagements, I thought it would be interesting to share with you guys where are we seeing the biggest amount of questions, or where, I guess, are our pain points or places where customers are looking to engage. I'd say carbon footprint data is the number 1 place where I'm spending my time these days, followed closely behind with sustainable and regenerative agriculture. We're seeing a big uptake in sustainable innovation. So I think as more companies are starting to look at how do they reduce their footprint, how do they start formulating to be more sustainable, and then human rights. So I would say if we look at this, that's what it looks like today. If I would have shown you this list 2 years ago, sustainable and regenerative agriculture, or probably more sustainable agriculture, would have been number 1, followed by human rights, and then carbon footprint probably would have been 3rd or 4th down. But with a lot of companies adopting science-based targets, we're seeing the demand, ever-growing demand for data in this space, or for help with data. So like everybody else, we've baselined our carbon footprint. This is nothing proprietary. We put this in CDP every year. But when we did our baselining, we used a combination of primary and secondary data, I think like everybody else here. And then, the struggle is, how do we continue to get better granularity around some of that secondary data? So I'm sure the same challenge that most people on this call have. I think Joao's covered a lot of this, but the challenges that we're facing with product carbon data is there are a variety of tools. I think a lot of times it can be difficult to determine which is most helpful. So we use an approach there. I think it's interesting to share, which is we have started saying, okay, we have our stakeholders and they have a lot of requests, and there's no shortage of stakeholders that want me to use a specific tool. So we've started asking ourselves what makes the most sense for Ingredion, and let's start there, and then let's figure out what we want to bolt on to that. I think a lot of the tools, particularly ones that we've had customers engage us with, require high level of data collection. So I won't name the tools, but we've had some where people have said, hey, this is going to speed up the process, and you're still looking at 7 months of data collection to be able to put it into the tool that's supposed to speed up the process. So I think that's the struggle we've had is if we're not going to do LCAs, where do we find a solution that helps speed things up? And like Zhao mentioned, LCAs can be costly. We just did one a few years ago. I think it cost us easily over $100,000 and took us about 11 months of data collection, and then a longer on top of that for the ISO validation on the back end of that. So very time consuming and not really a feasible approach for our company or our business model. And then I'll say this, updating the data can be challenging. I have a couple of customers that send me a quarterly spreadsheet and say, update anything in this that's different. As I don't know, thousands of data points that somebody's got to pour through and say, okay, this has changed, this hasn't. And I think the other challenge is we have had industry LCAs or other things that have been done in a collaborative nature. And then all of a sudden something changes, you change where you're sourcing, or you change, an innovation in the plant, and it renders the LCA somewhat, worthless. If you're lucky, you work with somebody who built you a spreadsheet and you can go through and maybe update some of the factors. But again, a challenge there with data from the LCA standpoint. So at Ingredion, to kind of manage this flood of data request, and this pyramid has grown since when we first discussed this idea, but we kind of have a hierarchy of carbon footprint data needs. So when a customer asks us for information, one of the first questions we ask is, what are you going to do with it? Not because we're trying to control where the information goes, but we want to understand the issue of granularity. What do you need? And I'd say at the base of that pyramid is academic data. Somebody comes in and says, I really just need to know what's the carbon footprint for corn in the US or something. Okay, I can go to the USDA and get some academic data or whatever and provide that. I'd say a level above that is maybe site level data estimates. We don't have metering on all of our equipment. So I would say at a very high level, we could take the carbon footprint of a site and divide it by the tons of product made and give you tons or kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of product average for a manufacturing site. In some cases, we can be a little bit more precise than that. Then we've got automated data, like Joao went through, HowGood and that system of providing you information. And then, I'd say at the top is LCAs. In some cases, I would say that, maybe is a little bit more distinct, but we do from time to time have a customer that comes and says, I want to make a product level claim, and my legal team says I need an LCA. And okay, so we understand that, right? There's a business purpose for doing that. I would have said to you, if we had this discussion a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, that 95% of our request could have been addressed at the bottom 2 sections of the pyramid. That people really were just trying to plug in. We're an ingredient, so we might be in 1 to 3% of an overall product, and they want, okay, I just need a generic cornstarch I can plug in. We're seeing that shift dramatically to the upper part of the pyramid as of the last probably year and a half or so. And again, I think that's around science-based targets, people trying to dig into scope 3, people trying to formulate for sustainability. I think there's a whole host of reasons why we're seeing people ask a lot more detailed questions and look for a lot more granularity in product level carbon footprinting. So that brings us to HowGood. We actually did not come to HowGood for product level carbon footprinting. We built our own sustainability scorecard for our innovators and came across HowGood and said, okay, I think they've taken what we did and made it better, made it more subjective, less objective. And so that's first and foremost what we came to the platform for, was how do we assess, product sustainability attributes. Determining carbon and water footprints has been a huge bonus for us, because obviously it's a much more quicker I think it took us less than 2 weeks to fill out the data spreadsheet and get everything put in the system, and so much more efficient in terms of time than doing LCAs. We use it to generate information for product marketing. We also love the fact that we can connect with formulators for companies in the HowGood system. So it's great if we have a customer that's on the platform and they're trying to reduce the carbon footprint of their product, and we can give them access to our ingredients, and they can make those changes. And I think it's a starting point for a dialogue and some discussion, but it's been really effective. I'll tell you, I haven't talked to a lot of formulators before we got involved with HowGood, and I'm talking to a lot more now, which I think is really exciting. And then, we also use it like Zhao showed in the demonstration to evaluate the benefits of sustainable product formulations. So I'll say this is an area where there's a lot of complexity, and we maybe gloss over that sometimes. But so, for example, we might have a customer that wants to reduce sugar by going to stevia. And they'll tell us, yeah, we're really interested in how it reduces the carbon footprint. And we can show them that. We've got LCAs on our stevia, but I think there's also like some of the hidden considerations there that maybe don't get asked in those discussions, which is there's parts of the world where the highest yields of stevia are, but there's also labor considerations and forced labor. And none of our customers want stevia from those parts of the world for those specific regions. And so I think that's the other good attribute is why you're trying to formulate for reducing your carbon footprint. We can also be like, wait a minute, the labor score got worse. Why was that? And use that to have a conversation about the complexity around formulating for sustainability or for reducing your carbon footprint. And so, bringing this all together, like I said, I didn't know that you were going to show our Vitessence pea protein, but fantastic. Just as an example of, we were at IFT, we formulated a pea protein cheese cracker where we used pea protein to replace whey protein. And in the prototype, people were able to sample at our booth. We were also able to show that we reduced water usage 6%, reduced the carbon footprint of the product 47%. And then at Ingredion, we have a proprietary consumer insights database called Atlas that we've been running for, 11 plus years. And we were also able to plug that information into Atlas and show a 5% increase in consumer preference on that product. So just an example of how we use this tool in real life. And then I think just a couple final thoughts before we turn it over to Q&A. But I think for finding a path to success, one of the things, and I actually heard a CSO at one of our customers mention this the other day too. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that says it, and I knew it wasn't. But perfection is the enemy of progress. I think we've spent so many years trying to say, well, but it's not quite right. Well, it's not wholly accurate. And we've, in our team, we've said, okay, like I look at it like climbing Mount Everest. We have a lot of people I deal with that say, well, I just want to put a flag on top of the mountain. And you're like, great. And they're like, well, so I can't do that this year. So I'm not going to do anything. And we're like, okay, but aren't there like 4 base camps on the way? Right. So I think sometimes people just kind of throw up their hands because it looks like an insurmountable task. And I would say, we're trying to make progress, right? And so I'm glad we've come across HowGood. We've found this to be a partnership, not transactional. I think they've done a great job of saying to us, okay, if you think those numbers aren't quite right, can we bring in our technical team? Can we review? But we've been really pleased and pleasantly surprised at all the stuff in the system that we did not get access to the platform for, but have been there, like the carbon footprint tool. And honestly, we're looking at, how can we use that to help meet that growing need. So that's it for my part, Zhao, if you want to open it up or finish off before we do Q&A.
Thank you so much, Brian. And yeah, I think, as Brian mentioned, as we open now up to Q&A, again, I know that a lot of you already posted questions in the Zoom chat, and so we're going to be going through those right now. And as we do so, I left here the QR code so you can connect with Brian. Brian is an amazing person to be connected to, as you could just see from the webinar now. Always great insights, so feel free to connect with Brian on LinkedIn. Also feel free to write to us here at HowGood if you're curious about the solution. And with that said, I'm maybe going to stop screen sharing for a second. And so I can see the questions of everyone with a little bit more detail, and then take us from there. So the first question that I can see, and please let me know if I missed something, is from Alberto. And Alberto asks, and I think Brian, maybe you'd be a good person to start responding to this. What is the overall framework to measure farm level emissions?
Yeah, I guess is that framework as in like what are the tools for measuring it, or what is the approach, or?
I think maybe kind of how maybe what tools are you using to measure farm level emissions? Yeah, that could be
Yeah,
good.
so I'd say it varies in different parts of the world. So in the US, we've got a system that's tied to it's got an API with Field to Market's field print calculator. And so we've kind of reduced the data load on that from, I don't know, an hour to down to less than 10 minutes for the growers. And then on the back end, they're getting some comparison data in a simple to understand report. So in the US, we get pretty good data from our growers. It becomes a lot more challenging when you get outside of that. You go to Thailand, and we've got 7,000 smallholder farmers in our tapioca supply chain. So we use tools like Cool Farm Tool, which I think is fairly popular out there. There's some others as well. And then we're looking at how can we have digital solutions that help us bridge the gap in some of those estimates. So, if we think we need primary data or we need to sharpen up what's in Cool Farm Tool, we have an app that we use with growers that we built in-house, but it lets us connect with the growers. We can receive questions from them. They can take a picture and say, what is this? And we can say it's mosaic crop disease, and here's how you treat it. And instead of just that engagement with one grower, we can push it out to all the growers through the app, but then also ask questions about farm practices that let us sharpen up, what goes into the Cool Farm Tool.
Thank you so much, Brian. And maybe a quick plug-in. I think one of the things that we've also built at HowGood was the integration with those types of systems. So for example, HowGood is also part of the Cool Farm Alliance. And so that's kind of one of the things that we want to make sure, because going back to 80% of emissions are driven by land use and agriculture. We want to make sure data at that level is very granular. And so having that type of integration with tools like Cool Farm is definitely important. And thank you, Brian, for sharing that. Then we have Christopher, who asks does your platform have the ability to account for soil carbon sequestration in regenerative production systems? I love this question because I'm an agroforestry smallholder farmer. And the quick answer is we do have a metric in the HowGood platform for soil organic carbon sequestration, and that you can use for internal decision making. Now we follow, going back to accounting standards, we follow the guidance from the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Forestry, Land, and Agriculture, and also the GHG Protocol Land Sector Removal Guidance. And currently, the draft guidance of SBTi says that carbon sequestration can only be accounted for when it's associated with primary data gathering. And so currently, you have some metrics that can give you some directional insights from the different impacts on soil organic carbon. But if you want to use it as a way to decarbonize your supply system or meet the climate commitment, definitely we would have to work with you to secure that primary data at the farm level. Brian, anything you want to add on soil organic carbon sequestration?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love the question, right? We have the same question as we put more and more of our crops into sustainable and regenerative practices. We want to make sure that we're, I guess, getting credit for it in the tool. So I love that you guys are looking at that. I think, look, as an industry, we're members of Sci Platform, and we've raised this question multiple times. Like, is there any way we can demonstrate that when we put something in a sustainable or regenerative practice that there's an average benefit in the carbon reduction or water reduction? So I think you guys are, through this HowGood platform, are helping us to get at some of that proof point. And then we'll need some on-farm primary data as well to help kind of substantiate that. But I would love to be able to just say in general to my executive team, yes, we're spending a lot of money doing this, but here's the benefit to our supply chain and to the planet, and how it's helping us meet our overall goals.
Yeah, spot on, Brian. And definitely still an area of opportunity for those of us in JG accounting. Alexandra Wesker also has a question, and specifically, I think for HowGood, does the automated system require the customer to input the formulation of products? Do supermarkets or retailers already do this? Is this a lot of manual work? So usually when we're working with manufacturers or suppliers like Ingredion, we actually have access to their formulation details. And that's why kind of, SOC 2 information security compliance is so important, so that information is protected, confidential. Now, when we're working with retailers, as you well mentioned, outside the private label brands, where they usually have more detailed information, they usually don't have the percentage inclusions of the product. And so in those cases, what we do is one of two things. Either those companies are already working with HowGood and are reporting that information to us. And so we basically help the retailer make accurate assessments based on formulation data that was reported by one of the CPG companies into HowGood. Or two, if we don't have that data, because we've evaluated already over 2 million products in our database for different product categories, we have predictive algorithms that allows us to use default conservative percentage inclusions for each of those ingredients depending on the product category, which of course is not going to be as precise as having the actual formulation, but it will be already a robust starting point for the retailer to start making some decisions and internal decision making. Then we have, do emission factors, so a question from Telma Santos, does the emission factors have in consideration the geography? If a retailer would choose a supplier from an origin that has low CO2 emissions, but the same retailer is in the other side of the world, is this included in the calculations? And the answer is absolutely yes. So usually we tend to see, usually the origin is quite an important factor when evaluating emission factors. Usually transportation emissions account for less than 5%. So of the overall life cycle emissions of the product. So sometimes it can actually be worthwhile to source a product from an origin that has lower emissions intensity, even if it's a little bit far out, especially if the product is not air fried. But Brian, I don't know, is there anything you want to share here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. One of the unintended consequences of us partnering with HowGood is I now have my procurement team asking me, can I go in the system and look and see if there's any difference between sourcing locations? So they'll say, okay, we're going to buy, whatever, this crop. I could get it from here, I could get it from here, and the price is comparable. Is there any environmental benefit? So now we're kind of using that to say, okay, let's look at, let's build the formulation, and then let's change the sourcing of that ingredient and see if it has an impact, which I think is kind of cool. I mean, it generates more work for my team, but yeah, I love that we're starting to look at that geographic difference in making purchasing decisions.
Yeah, and I was talking about kind of unintended users of the platform. One of the things for me that was like really mind blowing when we started working, Ryan, was to also see from an Ingredion perspective, like it was not just sustainability or procurement folks in the platform. You had a lot of the commercial team folks at Ingredion in the platform, which was beautiful to see because we don't usually see, commercial teams as engaged in sustainability decision making and communications. And and yeah, can you speak a little bit
I think we have almost as many strategic marketers in the system as we do technical people.
I love that. I love that. And I think, it really speaks to kind of the holistic sustainability strategy, and that in the end, it's everybody's job to drive sustainability in the organization. I think we have time for still a couple more questions. And so the next one is from Abigail. And she asks, have you found purchasing companies, do companies, I think the question is asking about, do companies generally have detailed geographic information of the farms that they're sourcing from? So Brian, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit into kind of how much traceability do you have?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're connected to the farmer, right? We're sourcing the crops and processing the ingredients. So I would say we have pretty good traceability. Where that there's a question mark would be, say, like the U.S. If I'm buying just regular dent commodity corn, I'm buying it on the open market from a grain elevator. So I know where my draw areas are in general. I may not know the exact farm that it's coming from. So when we go into HowGood and we're building out a formulation, we may say, okay, that corn could have come from Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, and we'll look at the relative percentage and make an educated guess or pick the largest percentage when we're putting it in the system. But I think for us, yeah, we do. But I do know that we've got a lot of customers, particularly during the pandemic, who realized that their supply chains were a lot more complex than they thought they were. So I mean, that's definitely an exercise that you'll have to go through, I think. And it's really good because when we filled out the spreadsheet to put our products into HowGood, it forced us to go back and have those conversations and make sure we were aligned and we actually knew where everything was coming from. So
thank you, Brian. And I think one thing, like if you're working in a company that sometimes, for example, you're working with a co-packer and sometimes you don't know exactly the sourcing locations, again, you can follow the GG accounting standards, specifically the one around conservativeness, and still kind of make an overall assessment of the emissions factor, the blue water footprint, the land use footprint of that product, even if you don't have that. The important thing is that you commit to work on getting that data over time. But the fact that you just only have a product in an ingredient list, that's already enough to get you started. We also have a question from Celine, and it's a question specifically for Brian. Brian, did you consider softwares, example EcoChain, that do LCAs at scale based on a physical allocation method? Did you see any pro and con? And João, any plan for HowGood to expand your offering solutions beyond food?
Yeah, I mean, to the software question, EcoChain was one of the software platforms that we had a customer ask us to use for their data. We've had others. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely pros and cons to it. I guess from a customer standpoint, it was probably fine. They weren't gathering all the data to put into EcoChain. They were getting the rolled up result. But we did find some of those to be pretty time consuming. I think we spent, I don't know, 6 months gathering up data to put into EcoChain. I think there was just a lot of granularity. And I will tell you that when we got our results out of HowGood, we went back and looked at where do we have LCAs, where did we have software like EcoChain results, and compared the results and found that, while there might be a little variance here or there, the speed and efficiency and cost were all things we took into consideration, right? But yeah, we've used those. Like, yeah, there definitely are some pros and cons. And again, if you're pushing that through your supply chain, and they're the ones doing all the data collection, then maybe the cons are not as big for you. But from an B2B supplier in that process, it was pretty labor intensive.
Thank you, Brian. And on the question of going beyond food, definitely within the food sector, HowGood's platform is completely unparalleled. Of course, I'm biased, but I invite you to try for yourself. Outside the food sector, we sometimes involve in kind of strategic projects with very clearly defined scopes of work to explore what might be possible. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out if you have a specific project in mind. And since we only have 2 minutes left, I wanted to maybe open up to have Brian maybe share a couple of maybe a final reflection on what would be a reflection or kind of a lesson or advice that you would give to people in this call that are interested in GHG accounting and in spending less time doing GHG accounting and driving successful decarbonization efforts.
Yeah, look, I mean, I talk to a lot of my peers, and I'll guest lecture with college kids and try to mentor people starting out in the field. I mean, one of the things I say a lot is follow the math, and the math is not just generating your carbon footprint, but it's also how much time is it taking, how much are you spending on that. But you've got to understand for your specific situation, what resources do you have to allocate, and how do you use those most efficiently to get the right level of detail that you need for what you're going to use the data for. And I think if you sit down and think about that, then it becomes a lot clearer as to what type of solution you need. It's a very similar process to what we did when generating the pyramid. We said, not everybody needs the same level of granularity. So why are we spending time trying to give people who want generic data, something really specific? I think it's a good exercise to go through and just kind of follow the math, figure out what your resources and budget. Yours might be bigger than mine, but I suspect everybody's in the same boat, which you're fighting for budget in your company. So what solutions are out there, and then what other benefits do you get from those solutions? Are you getting just one narrow focus, or are you getting other things that may provide value to your operation?
Thank you so much, Brian. And for those who didn't have their questions answered, rest assured, we will be taking a look at these questions, and we're going to be getting back to you. So no one is left without an answer. And with that said, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so much of your experience. And thank you to each and one of you for joining also today and trying to figure out how we can make sense of these complex GHG accounting landscape and spend less time measuring and spend more time driving real action on the ground, the action that we so desperately need. Thank you, and have a great rest of the week, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.